In the year 1804, a man named John Bell decided that his farm in North Carolina was just too small for his growing family. John and his wife, Lucy, had 6 children, and with every passing year, the house felt more cramped and the land felt less productive. John was a man of action, and when he realized that his current situation was not going to give his family the future he wanted, he made a big decision. He packed all of their belongings onto heavy wooden wagons, gathered his family, and set out on a long, grueling journey. They traveled more than 600 miles west, heading through rough terrain and dense wilderness, until they finally reached a 1,000-acre patch of land along the Red River in northern Tennessee. The area they settled in was known as Robertson County. At the time, it was an incredibly rural place, and basically nobody lived there. The trees were dense, the rivers were wild, and the roads were nothing more than dirt paths. The Bell family fully expected to have to work incredibly hard to survive. They knew they would have to clear the thick forests, build their own shelter, and work with the very few other families in the area to build up a small settlement from scratch. But this was exactly the kind of work that John Bell was born to do. He had been raised on a rough farm where he developed a reputation for working extremely hard and never giving up, no matter how difficult the circumstances became. John was also known for being very generous and excellent at working with other people. In fact, back when the family was still living in North Carolina, John and his very gentle and sweet wife, Lucy, would regularly open their front door to anybody who needed a place to stay or a hot meal. They did not care if the person was a stranger or an old friend. If you were hungry or cold, the Bells would take care of you. Sometimes, John would just give money to his neighbors when he felt like they had fallen on hard times, even if it meant his own family had to pinch pennies. So, after arriving in Robertson County and meeting the few neighbors they had, John got right to work. He began clearing heavy trees off of his massive plot of land. Using that freshly cut lumber, he built a beautiful 1.5-story log house up on a scenic hill, not far from the banks of the Red River. As it turned out, the Red River was a very popular picnic and fishing spot for the few people who lived in Robertson County. Because the Bell home was situated so close to this gathering area, the family was constantly running into their neighbors. They would wave, say hello, swap stories, and share meals. It did not take long at all before John and his family became some of the most popular and respected people in the entire area. For many years, the Bell family lived a very happy, peaceful, and prosperous life in Tennessee. Most mornings, John would wake up before the sun came over the horizon. He would gently wake up the children, who would then pack their lunches, leave the warmth of the log house, and walk through the nearby woods to attend their small local school. They would spend the day learning and then walk back through the forest, arriving home just before sunset. While the kids were at school, John and his older sons would spend their hours working the land, planting crops, or helping build new structures around the growing town. They also spent a lot of time building sturdy flatboats. They would use these boats to transport the tobacco and meats they produced on their farm down the river to southern markets for trade. Over the next few years, John and Lucy would have 3 more children, bringing their total to 9. Before long, their oldest children began getting married, starting families of their own, and building their own houses on nearby plots of land. Everything was going perfectly for the Bells. But one hot summer day in 1817, about 13 years after they first arrived in Robertson County, John would have a very strange experience. At the time, he completely wrote it off as nothing. But years later, the family would look back on that specific afternoon and say that was the exact moment when the nightmare started. On that summer day, John was completely by himself. He was out walking through his massive cornfield, which was located just a short distance from his house. The corn was tall and green, and the air was hot and still. As John walked down one of the rows, he looked out across the field and noticed something unusual. Sitting right in the middle of the cornfield was a massive dog. Now, there were plenty of dogs in Robertson County, so seeing a dog while you were out and about was not a shocking occurrence. But as John stared at this animal, he felt a sudden chill run down his spine. There was something deeply off about this dog. It looked almost misshapen, as if its bones had been broken many times over and had reset at awkward, unnatural angles. On top of that, the creature was simply too large to be a normal dog. It almost looked more like a giant wolf. The animal was sitting completely still, and it was staring directly at John. Its eyes were locked onto his, and it had an expression that felt disturbingly human. It did not blink, and it did not look away. Now, John was a tough man who did not easily get spooked. He spent his life in the wilderness and had faced plenty of wild animals. But as he stood there in the quiet cornfield staring back at this bizarre, silent creature, he could not help but feel a wave of intense panic wash over him. He felt completely unsettled. John was carrying his hunting rifle with him, so he slowly raised the barrel, took aim, and fired a shot directly at the dog. The moment the gun roared, the dog jumped up and took off running. John watched closely as the massive animal galloped away from him, weaving through the tall corn before disappearing into the thick tree line of the forest far away. Once the creature was completely out of sight, John decided to walk over to the exact spot where the dog had been sitting. He wanted to see if his bullet had hit it, or if there was any sign of where it had come from. When he reached the spot, he expected to see the tall corn stalks pressed down and bent from the weight of such a massive animal. But to his complete confusion, the corn was perfectly upright. There was absolutely no sign that any large creature had been sitting there at all. John looked down at the loose dirt on the ground, expecting to see heavy paw prints. But there were no tracks. There were no prints leading to the spot, and there were no prints heading in the direction of the forest where he had just watched the animal run. John stood there in the middle of his quiet field, completely baffled. After standing there for a few minutes trying to make sense of what had just happened, he eventually shook his head and decided he was just overthinking things. He told himself it was probably just a big, ugly stray dog and he had simply missed the shot. He decided it was no big deal. John turned around, walked back to his log house, and eventually forgot all about the strange dog in the cornfield. But not long after that afternoon, the Bell family began experiencing other strange and unsettling things back at their house. It started at night, right after everyone had climbed into their beds and turned off the lanterns. Just as the house went completely dark and quiet, they would hear a distinct heavy knocking sound coming from the outside walls of the house. The sound was clear and deliberate. As soon as John or one of his older sons would jump out of bed, grab a lantern, and run outside to inspect the walls, the knocking would instantly stop. They would walk all the way around the house, looking into the darkness, but they never saw anyone. Then, they would go back inside, climb back into their warm beds, and blow out the lanterns. The very second they laid their heads down on their pillows, the knocking would start up again. But now, it would be coming from a completely different side of the house. It felt as though someone or something was slowly circling the building in the dark, periodically tapping on the wooden walls just to let the family know it was there. John was convinced that this was not the work of any wild animal. He was sure it was a person, some local prankster who was hiding out in the dark woods and trying to scare them. Because of this, John gave his family very strict instructions. He told them not to mention these tapping sounds to anybody in town. John believed that if someone in the village was doing this to them, they would be waiting to see if the Bell family complained about it. He did not want the prankster to know that they were getting frustrated. He wanted the culprit to feel safe enough to keep coming back so that he could eventually catch them in the act. But over the course of several weeks, the tapping continued night after night. Every single time, John would lay awake in the dark, waiting for the first sound. The moment he heard it, he would sprint out the door, hoping to catch the person. But there was never anyone there. Even worse, when they searched the ground around the house the next morning, they never found any footprints, boot marks, or signs that anyone had ever been standing near the walls. As unsettling as these knocking sounds were, they were nothing compared to what happened next. One Sunday night in May of 1818, which was roughly 1 year after John had seen the strange dog in the cornfield, and a couple of months after the knocking on the walls had started, 4 of John's sons were asleep in their upstairs bedroom. The room was dark, and the boys were fast asleep when they were suddenly awakened by a bizarre sound. It sounded exactly like a giant rat was gnawing on one of their wooden bedposts. The boys were sleeping in 2 sets of bunk beds, with the 2 oldest brothers sleeping on the lower bunks. Instinctively, the older boys got up and stepped onto the cold floor, planning to search the dark room and chase the rat away. But the absolute second their feet touched the floorboards, the gnawing sound completely vanished. The room went dead silent. The 2 boys lit a candle and searched every single corner of the bedroom. They looked under the beds, behind the furniture, and in the closet, but they could not find a rat anywhere. When they closely examined the wooden bedposts, they were shocked to find that there were no teeth marks, wood shavings, or any signs that an animal had been chewing on them. The older brothers shrugged, assumed they must have been dreaming, and climbed back into their beds. They blew out the candle and closed their eyes. The very moment the room went dark, the gnawing sound started up again. Only this time, it was much louder and far more frantic. It sounded as though whatever was under their beds was desperately and violently trying to chew through the solid wood. Once again, the 2 older brothers leaped out of bed to catch the animal. And once again, the second their feet hit the floor, the sound stopped instantly. The room went perfectly still. The boys searched the room a second time, but found absolutely nothing. There was no sign of any rat or animal, and there were no marks on the underside of their beds. They had no idea what to make of it. The gnawing sounds continued for the rest of that night, making it completely impossible for the boys to get any sleep. The exact same thing happened the following night. The boys lay awake, exhausted, listening to the relentless sound of chewing that would stop every time they tried to investigate. But on the 3rd night, the entity in their room decided to change its tactics. The boys were laying in their beds, completely drained of energy from barely sleeping for 2 nights straight, when they heard a brand new sound. It did not sound like a rat anymore. Instead, they began hearing what sounded like someone gasping for air directly underneath their beds. It sounded as if a person was being choked, gulping heavily, smacking their lips, and frantically clawing at the underside of the wooden bed frames. The 2 oldest boys were absolutely terrified. They lay frozen in their beds, listening to the horrifying sounds of struggle happening just inches beneath them. Eventually, they worked up the courage to leap from their bed to confront whatever was making the noise. But as soon as their feet hit the floorboards, the choking and clawing sounds instantly stopped and the room went completely silent. This time, the boys were so frightened that they decided they could not just try to go back to sleep. They ran out of the room and woke up the rest of the family. John, Lucy, and the older sons searched the entire house from top to bottom. They looked in every room, checked the attic, and went under the porch, looking for any explanation. But there was nothing. There were no animal marks, no intruders, and no physical evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Up to this point, the Bell family had kept all of these strange events completely to themselves. They had not told a single person in town about the knocking on the walls, the rat gnawing sounds, or the gasping under the beds. Part of this was because John still hoped to catch whoever was behind it, but another part of it was fear. The family knew that if they went around town telling people that they were hearing invisible rats and gasping spirits under their beds, they would be ridiculed. People would think they were losing their minds. But after that night with the terrifying gasping sounds, the Bell children were simply too afraid to sleep. They were up all night, crying and trembling with fear. Realizing that his family was reaching a breaking point, John decided he had to get help. He went to one of his closest and most trusted neighbors and confided in him. He told him everything that had been happening inside his house over the past year. Now, John was not the kind of person who made things up. He was a very straightforward, serious, and honest man. He did not even tell jokes, so his neighbor knew that John was telling the absolute truth. The neighbor listened to this unbelievable story with a look of concern. He told John that he would come over and spend the night in the Bell house to see if he could hear these strange sounds for himself. That night, the neighbor joined John and his family inside the log home. They sat in the living room, waiting. Sure enough, as soon as the house went dark, the neighbor heard the distinct tapping on the outside walls. Later, when they retired to the bedrooms, the neighbor stood in the boys' room and heard the unmistakable sound of a rat gnawing on the wooden post, followed by the horrifying gasping and gulping sounds coming from beneath the beds. The neighbor was so utterly terrified by what he experienced that he could not even make it through the night. In the middle of the night, he grabbed his coat, walked out of the Bell house, and ran all the way back to his own home. After that night, word spread like wildfire through Robertson County. Everyone in town was talking about the terrifying things happening at the Bell household. Fortunately, the townspeople did not ridicule the Bells. Instead, they reacted with incredible support. The Bell family had been instrumental in building up the community, and John and Lucy were loved for their kindness and generosity. The townspeople decided they were going to do everything they could to help their friends. Other neighbors began volunteering to spend the night inside the Bell home. They hoped that having extra people around would make the Bell family feel more secure, and they also thought that their presence might scare off whatever was tormenting them. But it did not matter who stayed in the house. Every single night, the terrifying noises persisted. The townspeople came up with all sorts of natural explanations. Some suggested that John's youngest daughter was pulling a prank because she wanted attention. Others thought that there might be a rival family or a specific individual who hated John Bell and was targeting his home. There was even a theory that someone in the town had learned the art of ventriloquism, which is a performance where a person can throw their voice to make it sound like it is coming from somewhere else. The theory was that this ventriloquist was just a malicious prankster who was hiding near the house and screwing with the family. But no matter how hard they searched, nobody ever found any evidence of a prankster. The townspeople even went so far as to have volunteers watch each member of the Bell family as they slept at night, just to make sure none of them were causing the sounds while sleepwalking. But even when every single member of the Bell family was being closely monitored and was completely fast asleep, the loud knocking, gnawing, and gasping sounds would start up, proving that the family was entirely innocent. As the months turned into years, the Bell family was forced to endure this constant torment. Over time, the people in town began to notice a disturbing change in John Bell. Normally, John was a very engaged, sharp, and focused person. When he spoke to you, he would look you right in the eye and pay close attention to every word. But at some point after these mysterious events began, John's behavior started to degrade. He would be in the middle of a conversation with a neighbor when suddenly his eyes would go completely glossy. His jaw would drop slack, and he would look as though he was staring off into the distance at something no one else could see. Then his face would start to twitch. At first, these twitches were fairly minor, mostly centered around his eyes. But as time went on, they became much more dramatic and violent. His jaw would begin to quiver up and down uncontrollably, and his eyes would blink rapidly out of sync. When the twitching fits finally stopped, John would not say a word to the person he had been talking to. He would simply turn around, wander back to his house, walk up to his bedroom, and sit on the edge of his bed for hours and hours. He would just stare blankly at the wall, refusing to eat, refusing to drink, and refusing to speak to his worried family. The Bells felt like hostages in their own home. They had no idea what was causing these physical fits or why their lives were being ruined, and they lived in a constant state of dread. As for the townspeople, many of them began to believe that the torment was being caused by one of their own neighbors, a woman named Kate Batts. Kate was known for being very eccentric, unpleasant, and bitter. She had faced a lot of misfortune in her life, her husband had become severely disabled, and her 3 children had all died at a very young age. Kate also had a strange habit of using very big, complex words in her everyday conversations, but she almost always misused them, making her sound very bizarre to the locals. The townspeople began to whisper that Kate Batts was a witch, and they started referring to the entity tormenting the Bell house simply as Kate. When Kate found out about these rumors, she was deeply offended and publicly declared that she had absolutely nothing to do with whatever was happening to the Bells. By September of 1820, the terrifying events at the Bell household had been going on for 3 long years. Somehow, the family had just learned to live with the constant noises, but John Bell's health was rapidly failing. It was as if the longer this went on, the more John became a shell of his former self. His sudden dazes and violent twitching fits were happening multiple times a day now, and the hours he spent sitting in his room staring at the wall in silence grew longer and longer. In private, John would weep and tell his wife, Lucy, that he believed some invisible force was slowly torturing him to death. Then, one afternoon, one of John's daughters, Esther, left the house to go gather eggs from the hen house, which was located just across the dirt lane from their home. She walked out the front door, crossed the quiet road, and began walking up the path toward the hen house. As she was walking, she suddenly heard the sound of footsteps moving on the dirt behind her. She turned around and saw a woman dressed entirely in black clothing. The woman had her head bowed down and was walking slowly down the road that Esther had just walked on, heading directly toward the Bell house. Esther was confused because she had not seen this woman on the road just a moment ago, and she was not sure where she could have come from. But she was not too worried. She assumed it was just a neighbor or a visitor from out of town. Esther turned back around, walked into the hen house, and began gathering the eggs into her basket. When she finished, she stepped back outside onto the road, facing toward her home. To her surprise, the woman in black was still there. She was still walking slowly, with her head bowed, and she was now much closer to the Bell house. Esther began walking down the road, keeping her eyes on the stranger, trying to figure out who she was. As she got closer, she realized she recognized the woman's clothing. It was one of their neighbors from the village. Feeling relieved, Esther called out a friendly hello. But the woman in black did not turn around. She did not wave, and she did not react at all. She just kept walking slowly toward the house. Esther quickened her pace, getting closer, and called out again, asking how she was doing. Still, there was no response. At this point, Esther realized that there was absolutely nobody else around. It was just her and this silent, unresponsive woman who was now only about 15 feet ahead of her. Esther began to feel a deep sense of unease. She stopped walking and just stood in the middle of the road, staring at the woman's back. The exact second Esther stopped walking, the woman in black stopped too. She stood perfectly still for a moment. Then, without turning around, she slowly reached up with both hands, took her large bonnet off her head, and dropped it onto the dirt road. The moment the bonnet hit the ground, the woman's long, black, matted hair tumbled down over her shoulders and back. Still keeping her back turned to Esther, the woman reached her hands into her hair and began stroking it, running her fingers through the tangled strands as if she was trying to comb it out. Esther watched, feeling incredibly confused and uncomfortable. She decided to take a few slow steps forward to see if the woman was okay or if she needed help. But with every single step that Esther took, the woman began running her hands through her hair faster and faster. It quickly reached a speed that looked almost physically impossible. And then, Esther realized with absolute horror that the woman was not combing her hair. She was grabbing massive clumps of her own hair and violently ripping them directly out of her scalp. Esther could literally hear the sickening sound of hair being torn from the flesh. Within seconds, thick clumps of black hair were scattering all over the dirt road around the woman's feet. Esther was completely terrified. She realized there was something deeply wrong and dangerous about this person. Instead of trying to help, Esther bolted. She ran right past the woman, ran up the steps of her house, slammed the front door shut, and locked it behind her. She was trembling and gasping for breath. She called out for her sister, who was also home, and told her to come to the front window immediately. The 2 sisters stood by the window and peered out onto the road. The woman in black was still standing there in the exact same spot, violently ripping her hair out. At that moment, the woman suddenly froze. Her hands were still tangled in her bloody hair as she slowly raised her head and looked directly up at the window, making eye contact with Esther. The look on the woman's face was so cold and unnatural that both sisters shrieked and backed away from the glass. The woman slowly lowered her hands to her sides, keeping her eyes locked on the window. Then, she turned and walked around the side of the property, moving out of their line of sight. The sisters ran across the house to a side window to see where she was going. They saw the woman climbing up and over their wooden fence, entering their side yard. But as they watched, they noticed something even more terrifying. Walking directly behind the woman were three small children who had not been there before. The children were marching in a perfect, silent line right behind her. In plain sight of the two horrified sisters, the woman and the three children walked into a small grove of trees on the Bell property. One by one, starting with the woman and followed by each of the children, they climbed up into separate trees. Once they were all positioned high up in the branches, they turned around and stared directly at the side window where Esther and her sister were watching. Suddenly, all four of them began swaying their bodies violently back and forth. They moved with such force that the thick wooden trees began to bend and wave wildly to the left and right, as if a massive storm was blowing through the yard. Right at that moment, Esther's husband walked through the front door of the house. Hearing the sisters screaming, he rushed into the room to see what was wrong. Esther grabbed him, pulled him to the window, and pointed outside, telling him to look at the woman and the kids swaying in the trees. Her husband looked out the window, but his face went blank. He told them that he did not see any woman or children. He could only see the empty trees swaying unnaturally back and forth in the calm air. The sisters realized with horror that their husband could not see what they were seeing. Terrified and confused, the three of them ran out the back door and rushed into the side yard to confront whoever was there. But when they reached the grove of trees, the yard was completely empty. The trees were perfectly still, and there were no footprints or signs that anyone had been there. A few weeks later, in October of 1820, John Bell and one of his sons were out for a walk on their farm. As they were walking and talking, John suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He threw his hands up in front of his face, cowering as if someone was trying to strike him. Then his face went completely slack and his body began to twist and contort into horrible, grotesque positions. His back arched so far backward that his son could hear his bones popping, and it looked as though his spine was about to snap in half. John's son was absolutely horrified. He ran over, grabbed his father, and tried to pull him upright to keep him from hurting himself. As he held his father, a blood-curdling, high-pitched shriek filled the air. It was so incredibly loud and piercing that the son had to cover his ears. He had no idea where the sound was coming from, but it seemed to surround them. Just as suddenly as it had started, the attack stopped. John's body went limp, and he collapsed onto the grass. The shrieking sound vanished, and the farm went dead silent. The son helped his father sit up, and he saw that John was crying. John looked at his son and whispered that he did not have much time left. His son helped him to his feet, and the two of them walked silently back to the log house, where John went straight to bed and did not get up. On the morning of December 19, 1820, John Bell did not come down for breakfast. His family went up to his bedroom to check on him, and they found him laying in bed. He was still breathing, but he was completely unresponsive. No matter how much they shook him, yelled his name, or splashed water on his face, they could not wake him up. One of John's sons ran to the medicine cabinet in the hallway to grab his father's usual medicine. But when he opened the cabinet, he was shocked to find that all of the family's medicine was gone. In its place was a strange, small glass vial filled with a smoky, dark liquid. Nobody in the family had ever seen this vial before, and they had no idea how it got there. They immediately called for a local doctor to come to the house. When the doctor arrived, he examined John, but he could not figure out why the man would not wake up. The family showed him the strange glass vial. The doctor looked at it, shook his head, and told them that they needed to test the liquid on an animal to see what it was. The family went outside, found a stray cat, and forced it to swallow a few drops of the dark liquid. Within minutes, the cat began to twitch, collapsed, and died. The Bell family swore they had never seen the vial, and they had no idea who could have put it in their medicine cabinet. John Bell never woke up. The following morning, on December 20th, 1820, he took his final breath and died. Strangely, after John's death, the terrifying events at the Bell household came to a sudden halt. The knocking, the gnawing, and the gasping sounds simply stopped. Occasionally, people in the town reported seeing strange, glowing lights floating around the Bell property at night, and some claimed to hear a faint, singing voice coming from the woods. But the active torment was over. John's wife, Lucy, lived in the log house until she passed away in 1838. Today, there is absolutely nothing left of the original Bell home. However, there is a large, dark cave on the property, and many locals swear that whatever entity tormented and killed John Bell came from deep inside that cave, and some believe it is still waiting there today. At the end of December in 1984, in a tiny, impoverished village in northern India, a young woman named Sumitra gave birth to her very first child. It was a healthy baby boy, and the moment Sumitra held him in her arms, she fell completely in love with him. She had wanted to be a mother her entire life, and now that her dream had come true, she was overjoyed. She carried her little boy with her everywhere she went, wrapping him in a soft cloth and strapping him tightly to her chest. Whenever she had a free hand from cooking, cleaning, or doing chores around the house, she would use it to gently pat his head, tickle his tiny feet, and whisper sweet things to him. Life was not easy for anyone living in Sumitra's village. The village was located just south of the massive Himalayan mountains along the banks of the sacred Ganges River. It was an incredibly poor area. The residents lived in small mud huts with thatched roofs made of dried grass. There was no electricity, no running water, and basically nobody in the village had any kind of formal education. For Sumitra, life had been especially difficult, even compared to her neighbors. When she was just a little girl, her mother died suddenly. Her father had to travel constantly to distant cities just to find manual labor work so he could send money back home. Because of this, Sumitra was left alone for long periods of time and was mostly raised by a distant cousin who did not pay much attention to her. She grew up feeling incredibly lonely and abandoned. Even after she got married, her husband's job required him to travel frequently to find work, leaving her alone once again. Sumitra lived with her husband's parents in their cramped mud hut. While they were not cruel to her, she was not close with them at all, and her own family lived too far away to visit. Her life was defined by a quiet, crushing loneliness. But when her baby boy was born, everything changed. For the first time in her life, Sumitra did not feel alone. She had a purpose, and she was genuinely happy. She felt like something was finally going right in her life. But one afternoon in early 1985, everything took a terrifying turn. Sumitra was walking down a narrow dirt path toward the village well to fetch water, with her baby strapped securely to her chest. As she was walking, she suddenly came to a complete stop. Her body went incredibly rigid, and she dropped her heavy metal water bucket onto the dirt road. A couple of other villagers who were walking nearby heard the loud clang of the bucket hitting the ground. They turned around and saw Sumitra standing there, frozen like a statue. One of the villagers, feeling concerned, walked over to her and asked if she was okay. But Sumitra did not answer. She did not even look at them. She just stood there, completely paralyzed. The concerned villager looked down at Sumitra's hands and saw with horror that her fingers were bending backward so far, and with such force that it looked like they were about to snap off. The villager looked up at Sumitra's face and gasped. Her eyes had rolled completely back into her skull, showing only the whites of her eyes. On top of that, she was grinding her teeth together so violently that a loud, cracking sound echoed from her jaw as it moved side to side. The villager backed away in pure terror. At that moment, Sumitra's baby, who was still strapped to her chest, began to cry hysterically. The sound of the crying baby, combined with the sight of Sumitra standing in this grotesque, rigid pose, quickly attracted a crowd of other villagers. They gathered around her in a circle, staring in shock and whispering, completely unsure of what to do. Then, just as suddenly as she had frozen, Sumitra snapped out of it. She shook her head, fluttered her eyes, and looked around in confusion. She realized her baby was crying, and she saw a crowd of people staring at her. Feeling deeply embarrassed and confused, Sumitra quickly picked up her water bucket, held her crying baby close, and hurried past the crowd toward the well. When she returned to her hut, she did not tell her husband or her in-laws about what had happened. Honestly, she could not really remember the details of the event. She convinced herself that it was just a one-time thing, probably caused by the extreme stress and lack of sleep that came with taking care of a newborn. But a few weeks later, it happened again. This time, the strange trance lasted much longer. Sumitra's father-in-law walked into the kitchen and found her standing perfectly rigid, with her hands bent backward and her eyes rolled back into her head. He shook her, screamed her name, and tried to wake her up, but she remained completely unresponsive for nearly 10 minutes before finally snapping out of it. When she came to, she had absolutely no memory of the event. By May of 1985, about 5 months after her very first episode, Sumitra was falling into these bizarre trances almost every single day. They were lasting for hours at a time, leaving her completely exhausted. Even more disturbing, Sumitra began to speak while she was in these trances. But the things she said made absolutely no sense. She would suddenly bark out desperate cries for help, screaming that her head was being crushed and that someone needed to save her. Then, her voice would drop to a terrifying low whisper, and she would say that all she could see was darkness. Sumitra's family was deeply worried. They contacted the local village medicine man, who came to the hut and examined her. But he could find nothing physically wrong with her. Outside of the trances, she was the absolute picture of perfect health. On July 16, 1985, Sumitra fell into another deep trance while she was in the middle of cooking. While she was frozen, she began to speak, but her voice was different this time. She was incredibly calm. She looked forward with her empty eyes and said that in exactly 3 days, she was going to die. By this point, Sumitra was terrified of her own body, and her family was completely drained. She had stopped taking care of her baby boy, who was now 8 months old, because she was terrified that she would fall into a trance while holding him and accidentally drop or hurt him. Her mother-in-law had basically taken over as the baby's mother. Sumitra's husband had to stop traveling for work, meaning they had no income, just so he could stay home and make sure his wife did not hurt herself during her episodes. Finally, July 19, 1985 arrived. This was the day that Sumitra had predicted she would die. She woke up feeling extremely anxious. She made a conscious effort to avoid doing anything that could put her in danger. She refused to go near the stove because she did not want to be near fire. She did not walk near any ledges, and she refused to go near the stairs. She kept a safe distance from her baby, spending most of the day sitting quietly in the corner of the hut. By the late afternoon, nothing bad had happened and she seemed perfectly fine. Her family began to relax, thinking that the prediction was just the nonsense of a sick mind. As Sumitra's mother-in-law began preparing dinner, Sumitra decided to step outside into the front yard to get some fresh air. Across the dirt road, she saw one of her close friends. Sumitra smiled and waved to her. Her friend waved back and cheerfully began walking across the road to chat. But as her friend got closer, Sumitra suddenly froze. Her eyes rolled back, her body went rigid, and she fell into another trance. Now, the friend, like everyone else in the village, was used to seeing Sumitra do this, so she was not too worried at first. But then, Sumitra began doing something she had never done before. Instead of keeping her hands locked at her sides, Sumitra slowly raised her hands up to her forehead. Then, she began wildly and violently clawing at the air right above her head, as if she was trying to fight off an invisible attacker. Her breathing became incredibly loud, heavy, and labored. Feeling a sudden wave of panic, the friend rushed over to help her. But there was nothing she could do. Sumitra continued to claw at the sky, gasping for air. Suddenly, she stopped. She dropped her hands back to her sides and returned to her rigid pose. Then, a low, rattling groan escaped from her throat. It was a deep, constant sound that got lower and lower until her voice cracked, and then Sumitra went completely still. Her friend, who was standing right next to her, realized that even though Sumitra was standing perfectly upright, she was not breathing. Her chest was not moving and her skin was rapidly turning pale. The friend began screaming for help. Sumitra's husband, her in-laws, and several neighbors ran outside and crowded around her. The medicine man arrived a few minutes later, pushed through the crowd, and immediately checked Sumitra. He checked her pulse, listened for a heartbeat, and looked into her eyes. After a minute, he stepped back, looked at the crying family, and said that she was dead. Sumitra's husband collapsed to his knees, weeping. Her mother-in-law, who was holding the baby, began to sob. All the while, Sumitra's body remained standing perfectly upright and rigid, her face frozen in a silent scream. Eventually, the medicine man and Sumitra's father-in-law laid her stiff body down onto the dirt. In this remote village, there was no hospital or morgue. According to their religious customs, it was extremely important to perform the funeral rituals and cremate the body as quickly as possible. The villagers immediately began making preparations. The women of the village gathered around Sumitra's body, scrubbing her clean and applying essential oils to her face. Other villagers went into the woods to gather dry timber to build the funeral pyre. The atmosphere in the village was thick with grief and fear. The villagers could not stop thinking about how Sumitra had accurately predicted her own death. They began to whisper that dark, demonic forces were at play, and parents forced their children to stay inside their huts. As the sun began to set, only the women cleaning the body remained outside. One of the women was gently brushing out Sumitra's long hair when suddenly she froze. She screamed, dropped the brush, and scrambled backward in terror, pointing at Sumitra's face. The other women looked over and began screaming as well, running away from the body as fast as they could. What they saw was impossible. Sumitra's eyes were still closed, but her eyeballs were darting rapidly left and right beneath her eyelids. Suddenly, her chest expanded as she took in a massive, sudden breath of air. She let out a long, loud exhale, opened her eyes, and sat bolt upright. She looked around at the terrified women. Her skin was no longer pale. She looked completely healthy and normal, even though she had not had a heartbeat or been breathing for the past 45 minutes. Hearing the screams, the medicine man ran over. He helped the wobbly Sumitra stand up on her feet. He quickly checked her pulse and heartbeat and then turned to the gathering crowd of villagers with a huge smile. He announced that they had just witnessed a miracle and that Sumitra had come back from the dead. Sumitra's husband was overcome with joy. He ran forward to hug his wife, but as he approached, Sumitra jumped backward. She put her hands up to block him, looking at him with intense fear and anger. The medicine man stepped in, telling the husband that she was probably just confused and needed time to recover from the trauma. The villagers slowly returned to their huts, assuming she would be back to normal after a good night's sleep. The medicine man helped Sumitra into her bed, where she quickly fell asleep. But the next morning, things only got stranger. Sumitra woke up, but as soon as she saw her husband and her in-laws, she screamed in terror, ran out of the hut, and began sprinting down the road. The medicine man, her husband, and her father-in-law chased after her. When her husband finally caught her and grabbed her arm, Sumitra slapped him and screamed, asking how he dared to touch another man's wife. She screamed that they were not her family and that this was not her home. They had to drag her kicking and screaming back to the hut. Once inside, she kept yelling that her name was Shiva Dueti, and she accused her in-laws of trying to kill her. Over the next few weeks, Sumitra's family tried everything to snap her out of this state, but nothing worked. She refused to touch her baby boy and instead demanded that they bring her Ringu and Tinku. When they told her they did not know who that was, she would fly into a rage. Even though Sumitra had never gone to school and did not know how to read or write, she suddenly began sitting in her room and writing long, detailed letters to people she had never met, begging them to come take her home. She began rapping her sari in a completely different style, refused to eat off the family's dishes because she said they were dirty, and her voice became much higher and faster. The villagers eventually concluded that her brain had been severely damaged when she died, and they stopped trying to help her, focusing instead on keeping her from running away. Then, on October 20th, 1985, 3 months after she had died and come back to life, there was a knock on the front door of the hut. Sumitra's husband opened it and saw an older, well-dressed man standing there. The man was wearing a nice suit and polished leather shoes, which was incredibly unusual for their poor village. He was clutching a large, expensive leather-bound book to his chest and looked very nervous. The man introduced himself as Ram Trapathy. In a quiet voice, he asked if there was a young woman living in the house who had recently started acting like a completely different person. Sumitra's husband was stunned. He had no idea who this man was or how he knew about his wife's condition. He told the man to wait, walked into the bedroom, and told Sumitra that a man named Ram Trapathy was outside asking for her. For the past 3 months, Sumitra had been depressed and distant. But the moment she heard that name, her face lit up. She let out a gasp, leapt out of bed, ran to the front door, and threw her arms around Ram Trapathy, hugging him tightly. She whispered something into his ear. When Ram Trapathy heard her whisper, his face went pale, and he looked at her with a mixture of shock and anger. He gently pushed her away and asked her what her name was. Sumitra looked at him with tears in her eyes and said her name was Shiva Dueti. Ram Trapathy stood frozen. He gestured for her to sit down with him on a low stone wall outside. He opened his leather-bound book, which was filled with family photographs. He pointed to a picture containing a group of people and asked her if she could identify them. Sumitra did not hesitate. One by one, she correctly named every single person in the photograph. These were people that her husband had never seen before in his life. Ram Trapathy turned the page and pointed to another photo, and once again, Sumitra named everyone correctly. Finally, Ram Trapathy turned to a photo of a single woman. He asked her if she knew who that was. Sumitra's face darkened with anger. She pointed at the photo and said that it was her sister-in-law, and she accused her of killing her by hitting her over the head with a heavy brick. Hearing this, Ram Trapathy dropped his book, grabbed Sumitra and began sobbing hysterically, hugging her as tight as he could. He turned to Sumitra's bewildered husband and told him that they needed to go inside so he could explain everything. Inside the hut, Ram Trapathy explained that Shiva Dueti was his daughter. She had lived in a city about 60 miles away. Shiva was highly educated, wealthy, and had 2 young sons named Tinku and Ringu. But Shiva's life had been a nightmare. Her in-laws hated her because of her education and her family's wealth. By early 1985, around the same time Sumitra began having her trances, Shiva was experiencing terrible nightmares and fighting constantly with her in-laws. On the night of May 18, 1985, which was when Sumitra first started speaking in her trances, Shiva's neighbors saw her in-laws carrying her unconscious body along the nearby railroad tracks. The next morning, Shiva's dead body was found on the tracks. Her head had been brutally bashed in, but her in-laws claimed she had committed suicide by jumping in front of a train, and they quickly cremated her body before her father could get an autopsy. Shiva's father was convinced she had been murdered. He had recently heard a bizarre rumor about a young woman in a distant village who had come back from the dead and was claiming to be his deceased daughter. He did not believe it at first, but decided to visit and test her. When Sumitra had run out of the house and hugged him, she had whispered the word "Papa" into his ear. That was why he had recoiled, thinking it was a cruel hoax. But after she correctly identified all of his relatives and revealed that she had been murdered with a brick, a detail that had never been made public, he knew that his daughter's spirit was alive inside Sumitra. This case is widely considered to be one of the most credible and thoroughly documented cases of reincarnation in human history. Researchers from the University of Virginia traveled to India to study Sumitra and concluded that it was not a hoax. Sumitra's voice, accent, handwriting, and personality had completely changed to match Shiva's. Sumitra lived the rest of her life as Shiva, and Shiva's parents fully accepted her as their daughter. She eventually accepted her village family and helped raise her son until she passed away in 1998. In the late evening hours of August in the year 2015, a 16-year-old girl named Nee Perez suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She lay perfectly still in the dark, tiny bedroom, listening to the quiet breathing of her relatives who were sleeping on the floor around her. As she cleared the sleep from her mind, she realized that she had woken up because she desperately needed to use the bathroom. She carefully stood up, stepping over her sleeping family members as she made her way toward the back door of the house. Nye lived in a small, impoverished town called La Entrada, which is located in Honduras, one of the poorest and most dangerous countries in the entire world. But despite the difficult and dangerous reality of her surroundings, Macy, as her family affectionately called her, was incredibly happy. She had recently married the young boy she was deeply in love with, a teenager named Rudy. On top of that, Macy was pregnant with their very first child, who was due to be born in just a few months. She was excited about starting her new family, and her life felt full of hope. Nye reached the back door of the house, pushed it open, and stepped out into the warm, humid night air. She began walking across the dark backyard toward the small wooden outhouse, but Nye would never actually reach the outhouse. The following morning, Nye's mother, Maria, was the first person in the house to wake up. As she walked past the back door to start her morning chores, she looked out into the yard and gasped. There, lying face down on the grass, was her daughter, Nye. Maria screamed, ran outside, and flipped her daughter over. Nye was completely unresponsive, and a thick white foam was bubbling out of her mouth. Now, because they lived in a very poor, remote part of Honduras, professional medical care was practically non-existent. The region was also deeply religious and superstitious. Because of this, Maria's first thought was not to call an ambulance or take her daughter to a hospital. Instead, as the rest of the family ran outside in a panic, they decided that Nye had been possessed by malevolent demons. They immediately called for a local priest to come to the house to perform an urgent exorcism. The priest arrived and spent hours praying over Nye's body, but nothing changed. She remained completely limp and unresponsive. Finally, realizing that the exorcism was not working, Maria and the rest of the family carried Nye to the nearest local hospital. But by the time they arrived, the doctors examined her and told the family that it was too late. Nye was dead. When the family asked the doctors what had caused her sudden death, the doctors shook their heads and said they did not know. Heartbroken, confused, and filled with grief, the family brought Nye's body back home. They held a quick, simple memorial service, and then they took her body to the cemetery to bury her. The following day, Nye's teenage husband, Rudy, was completely destroyed by grief. He had lost not only his beautiful young wife, but also his unborn child. He could not bring himself to stay inside the house, so he got up early and decided to go to the cemetery just to be near her. He walked to the cemetery and found his wife's grave. In this part of Honduras, bodies were not buried deep underground. Instead, Nye had been placed inside a wooden coffin, and that coffin had been slid into a large, hollow, above-ground cement block tomb. Once the coffin was inside, workers had used fresh, wet cement and bricks to completely seal the opening, turning the block into a solid, airtight tomb. Rudy walked up to his wife's cement block, leaned his head against the rough stone, and began to sob quietly in the silent cemetery. But just seconds later, Rudy heard a sound that made his heart stop. He went completely silent, stood up, and stared at the cement tomb in absolute shock before sprinting away to get help. It turned out that the day before, just a couple of hours after Nye's coffin had been sealed inside the airtight cement tomb, Nye had suddenly opened her eyes. She had never actually been dead. It is still unclear what originally caused her to collapse in her backyard, but experts believe she either suffered an extreme panic attack brought on by a nearby gunshot, or she had a severe episode of cataplexy. Cataplexy is a sudden, uncontrollable loss of muscle function that is often triggered by intense emotions like fear or shock. In severe cases, it can cause complete temporary paralysis, making the person appear dead even though they are fully conscious. The doctors at the hospital had made a horrific, fatal mistake. When Nye was brought to them, she was still alive. When she finally woke up, she found herself trapped in pitch-black darkness, squeezed inside a tight wooden coffin that was encased in solid, airtight cement. In a state of sheer terror, she began screaming at the top of her lungs, pounding her fists and kicking her feet against the wooden walls of the coffin. She fought so violently that she managed to force her hands up to her face and shatter the small glass viewing window built into the lid of the coffin. But breaking the glass did not help her. It only allowed sharp shards of glass to fall into her eyes and mouth, and on the other side of the glass was nothing but solid, cold cement. She was trapped. She spent more than 24 hours screaming, crying, and desperately clawing at the coffin, hoping someone would hear her. But nobody did until her husband, Rudy, came to the cemetery and pressed his ear directly against the cement block to cry. He heard his wife's muffled, desperate screams coming from inside the stone. Rudy ran and gathered his family, and they rushed back to the cemetery with sledgehammers. They violently smashed open the cement block and pulled the wooden coffin out. When they opened the lid, they saw that Nye's hands were bloody and raw, and there was glass on her face. To their amazement, she still had a very faint heartbeat. They rushed her to the hospital, but by the time they arrived, she was gone. Nye had finally run out of oxygen and suffocated, likely dying just minutes before her husband was able to break through the stone to save her. On a bright, beautiful summer day in the year 1906, a prominent doctor named William C. Clark and his wife Harriet were driving slowly through Litchfield County, a scenic area located in northwestern Connecticut. Litchfield was a beautiful, rural, and incredibly hilly region filled with thick forests and winding dirt roads. The Clarks, who lived full-time in the bustling and chaotic environment of New York City, were visiting the area to try to find a perfect, quiet plot of land where they could build a second home. Dr. Clark was a highly successful oncologist or cancer specialist, and he also worked as a prestigious professor at the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. While their life in New York was exciting and successful, it was also incredibly fast-paced, stressful, and tiring. The couple wanted a place where they could escape the noise of the city, and Litchfield County felt like the perfect sanctuary. As they drove their car along the quiet country roads, they eventually crossed over a beautiful, old, covered wooden bridge. As they came out the other side, they looked up to their right and saw a stunning view of a massive mountain. High up on the mountainside was a thick, shaded forest that looked completely untouched by modern civilization. They noticed a small, overgrown dirt road that seemed to branch off from the main road and disappear into the dense tree line. The couple had no idea what was up there, but they felt a strange, sudden pull toward the woods. It was so incredibly beautiful and peaceful that they decided to go check it out. Dr. Clark turned the car onto the overgrown access road. But as they began to climb the steep hillside, the road quickly became very bumpy, rocky, and covered in thick weeds. It was obvious that no cars had driven up this path in a very long time. Before they even reached the edge of the forest, the road became impassable. Dr. Clark pulled the car over, parked it on the grass, and he and Harriet got out to continue their exploration on foot. The moment they stepped past the tree line and entered the forest, the bright summer sunlight faded away. The canopy of leaves above their heads was so incredibly thick that it blocked out the sky, making the air feel cool, crisp, and refreshing. At first, the forest felt completely still, but as they walked deeper, the woods seemed to come alive around them. They could hear birds chirping in the branches, small animals rustling in the leaves, and insects buzzing in the cool air. Up ahead, they came across a beautiful open field filled with wild apple trees. A large deer was standing right in the middle of the field, quietly eating apples directly off the branches. Just past the apple orchard, the overgrown path was lined with massive, fragrant patches of wild roses, sweet lilacs, and bright yellow, bitter tansy flowers. They crossed over several small, clear, babbling brooks, and in the distance they could hear the soothing sound of fresh spring water rushing down the mountain. As the sun shifted, rays of light poked through the thick leaves, making the forest floor appear to sparkle. The mountain was made of a type of rock that was rich in mica, a shiny mineral that shimmered like diamonds when the sunlight hit it. And then there were the owls. As the Clarks walked deeper into the woods, they could hear the distinct, gentle hooting of owls echoing from all directions. To the couple, the forest felt absolutely enchanted, as if the owls were personally welcoming them to their new home. By the time they turned around to walk back to their car, they had already made up their minds. They were going to build their dream cabin in these woods. After returning to New York City, they immediately filled out the paperwork to purchase a massive 1,000-acre plot of land inside this forest. The forest had a name, Dark Entry Forest. It was named that because of how dark and shaded it was, even in the middle of a sunny summer day. As they had explored the land, they had noticed several crumbling stone walls and old overgrown home foundations scattered across the forest floor. It was clear that a town had existed here at some point, but the ruins were so old that the Clarks simply thought they added historical charm to the property. After the purchase was finalized, Dr. Clark began contacting local construction companies in Connecticut to hire builders to help him construct the cabin. But to his confusion, every single builder he called turned him down. None of them would give him a straight answer as to why they were refusing the job. Dr. Clark assumed that they just did not want to travel to such an isolated and difficult-to-reach area for a single house. He was not discouraged. He had grown up on a farm in New Jersey and was very handy and experienced with manual labor, so he decided he would just build the cabin himself. Over the next several months, Dr. Clark traveled from New York to Dark Entry Forest every single weekend. He worked tirelessly, cutting down a large patch of hemlock trees on a flat piece of his land. Using that lumber, he built a beautiful, rustic, two-story wooden cabin. He found a freshwater spring at the top of a nearby hill and laid piping down to his cabin so they would have running water. At the bottom of the hill was a clear, rushing brook filled with darting trout. Dr. Clark loved watching the fish, so he built a beautiful swimming pool with soft, mossy stone embankments right next to the water. By Thanksgiving of that year, the cabin was finally complete. Dr. Clark and Harriet spent the holiday weekend there, relaxing in their pool, watching the trout, and listening to the owls hooting in the dark woods. They both agreed that they had found their own personal paradise. Every summer and holiday, they would travel to the cabin to hike, swim, and watch the leaves change colors. It was absolutely perfect until the summer of 1918. That summer, while they were staying at the cabin, Dr. Clark received an urgent message calling him back to New York City to handle a medical emergency. Harriet was deeply upset about being left completely alone in the isolated cabin in the middle of the dark forest. When she dropped her husband off at the local train platform, she made him promise that he would return as quickly as possible. He hugged her, promised he would be back in just a couple of days, and got on the train. As the train pulled away, he looked out the window and saw Harriet standing on the platform with her arms crossed, watching him go. He had no idea that his wife was about to experience a living nightmare. You see, when the Clarks bought their land, they had done absolutely no research on the history of Dark Entry Forest. If they had, they never would have bought it. The ruined town they had seen was named Dudleytown, and it had been completely abandoned because the locals believed the land was heavily cursed. The town was settled in the 1740s, And at first, it was a successful community of 30 families, but soon horrific tragedies began to plague the residents. In 1759, the Carter family moved to Dudleytown, and within months, 6 members of the family died of cholera. The survivors fled to New York but were immediately massacred by Native Americans. In 1792, a resident named Hollister died mysteriously in the home of a man named Tanner. Shortly after, Tanner went completely insane, babbling about terrifying, shadowy creatures he was seeing in the woods at night. Tanner's neighbor, Abel, also began seeing the same creatures and eventually lost his mind as well. In the early 1800s, a Revolutionary War hero named General Herman Swift moved to the town. Shortly after, his wife was struck and killed by lightning on their porch, driving the general completely insane. In 1813, a mysterious epidemic swept through the town, killing dozens of residents. By 1900, only one family remained. The Brophy, in quick succession, all of their sheep died of a mysterious disease. The mother died of tuberculosis, the 2 sons disappeared, and their home burned to the ground. The father, John Brophy, went insane with grief and wandered into the forest, never to be seen again. This was why the local builders had refused to help Dr. Clark. They were terrified of the curse of Dudleytown. Back in 1918, Dr. Clark was able to handle his medical emergency quickly. He boarded a train back to Litchfield County just 36 hours after he had left. When the train pulled into the station, he stepped onto the platform, expecting to see Harriet waiting for him. But the platform was completely empty. Dr. Clark was not a superstitious man, but he felt a sudden, heavy sense of dread in his chest. He knew his wife was terrified of being alone, so there was no reason she would not have come to meet him. Feeling panicked, he began walking quickly toward the forest. The moment he stepped into the shade of Dark Entry Forest, he noticed that the woods were incredibly loud. The owls were hooting frantically, and the sound was piercing and aggressive. Dr. Clark began to run. He sprinted along the overgrown road, his heart pounding as the screeching of the owls grew louder and more chaotic. He finally reached the clearing of his property and saw that the front door of his cabin was standing wide open. He ran up the porch steps, but just as he reached the threshold, a sudden, high-pitched noise echoed from the second floor of the cabin. The sound was so jarring and bizarre that Dr. Clark froze in his tracks. He stood there, listening to the frantic owls behind him and the strange noise upstairs. After a moment, he realized what the sound was. It was the sound of maniacal, uncontrollable, and completely insane laughter. Sensing that his wife was in grave danger, Dr. Clark drew a deep breath, ran into the house, and rushed up the stairs. He could tell the laughter was coming from their master bedroom. He ran down the hallway, pushed open the bedroom door, and gasped. Harriet was huddled in the far corner of the room, curled into a tight ball on the floor. Her hands were clenched into tight fists, her eyes were wide open and completely unblinking, and her mouth was stretched open wider than seemed humanly possible. The terrifying, high-pitched laughter was pouring out of her throat, even though her chest was barely moving and her eyes were locked onto his. She was completely gone. During the 36 hours she had been left alone in the forest, something had driven Harriet completely insane. She spent the rest of her life in a mental asylum, babbling about the terrifying, shadowy creatures she had seen in the trees. Today, Dudleytown remains completely abandoned, and it is illegal to trespass on the property, but those who have snuck in report feeling sudden drops in temperature, being pushed by unseen hands, and capturing terrifying, shadowy figures in their photographs. In the early evening hours of December 24, 2011, a 26-year-old mother named Giselle Preston was sitting on her bed in her small apartment in Anaheim, California. The room was quiet, and Giselle was happily wrapping colorful Christmas presents for her children. Laying on the mattress next to her was her newborn baby boy, who was only 7 weeks old. This Christmas was an incredibly big deal for Giselle and her husband, 30-year-old William Wallace. Their relationship had been incredibly toxic, unstable, and at times violently abusive over the past 3 years. But earlier that year, when Giselle discovered she was pregnant, the couple decided to put their differences aside. They reconciled, promising to work together to create a peaceful, loving home for their new baby and Giselle's 2 older daughters, who were 3 and 8 years old. After wrapping the final present, Giselle picked up her baby boy, met up with William and her daughters in the living room, and they all walked next door to celebrate Christmas Eve at a festive party with their neighbors. Early the next morning, on Christmas Day, the 2 little girls woke up early, filled with excitement. They ran out of their bedrooms and rushed down the hallway into the living room to see what Santa had left for them. The room was beautiful, fully decorated with bright, multicolored lights on the Christmas tree, green wreaths on the walls, and stockings stuffed with candy hanging over the fireplace. William and Giselle were already sitting on the living room couch, with the baby sleeping in a small bassinet nearby. The little girls ran to the tree, grabbed their first presents, and looked over at their father. William gave them a warm smile and a nod, giving them permission to start opening their gifts. The girls happily tore into the wrapping paper, giggling as they revealed their brand new toys. Reflexively, they turned around to show their mother. William smiled and said how cool the toys were. But Giselle did not say a word. She sat perfectly still on the couch, wearing a pair of dark sunglasses, and completely ignored them. The girls called out to her, waving their toys, but she remained completely silent and unresponsive. The 8-year-old girl turned to William and asked what was wrong with her mother. William's face hardened, and he looked at Giselle with an expression of disgust before looking back at the little girl. He told her that her mother had gotten drunk the night before and had ruined Christmas. The girls could tell by his angry tone that their parents were fighting again, so they did what they always did to avoid conflict. They turned back around and quietly kept opening their presents, trying to ignore the silent tension behind them. At around 9 in the morning, William stood up, walked into the kitchen, and made a quick phone call. A few minutes later, there was a loud knock on the front door, and paramedics rushed into the apartment. It turned out that the night before, after returning from their neighbor's party, Giselle and William had gotten into a brutal physical argument. During the fight, William had violently beaten Giselle to death. When he realized she was dead, he panicked. He did not want his children's Christmas to be ruined, and he wanted to buy himself time. So, he dragged Giselle's body into the living room, propped her up on the couch, and put sunglasses on her face to hide her swollen, lifeless eyes from her children. The little girls had spent the entire morning opening their Christmas presents in front of their mother's dead body. William was immediately arrested and eventually convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison, and Giselle's children were taken in and raised by her grieving parents. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.